There are mysteries that science has tried to solve for decades, sometimes for centuries, and still cannot fully explain. A mechanical device pulled from a shipwreck that should not have existed for another 1,000 years. A manuscript written in a language no scholar, no cryptographer, and no machine has ever been able to read. A group of experienced hikers who vanished into the snow under circumstances so strange that even Soviet investigators closed the case with the chilling phrase, "a compelling unknown force." These are not legends whispered around a campfire. These are real documented cases, sitting in real archives, photographed by real investigators, and still, after all this time, they refuse to give up their secrets. Today, we're going to travel through some of the most baffling unsolved mysteries in the world, cases where the evidence is solid, but the explanation is missing. So fasten your seatbelt, because by the end of this video, you may find yourself questioning how much of our history in our world is actually settled fact. But first, you'll have incredible luck if you like and subscribe before this video ends. Stay until the very end, because the final mystery on this list is one that investigators reopened only a few years ago, and what they found only deepened the case rather than closing it. The Voynich Manuscript. In the rare books room of Yale University's Beinecke Library sits a manuscript that has frustrated some of the sharpest minds of the last 100 years. It is known as the Voynich Manuscript, named after the Polish book dealer Wilfrid Voynich, who acquired it in 1912 from a Jesuit college in Italy. The book is small enough to hold in one hand, roughly 240 pages of vellum, filled from cover to cover with flowing, looping handwriting in a script that matches no known language on Earth. Carbon dating conducted in 2009 placed the vellum itself to the early 15th century, somewhere between 1404 and 1438, ruling out the once popular theory that it was a modern hoax cooked up by Voynich himself to inflate the value of his find. What makes the manuscript so unsettling is not just the unreadable text, but the illustrations that accompany it. Page after page shows plants that do not match any known species, root systems that seem anatomically impossible, and elaborate diagrams of interconnected tubes and basins that some researchers have likened to biological or pharmaceutical apparatus. Other sections appear to chart the stars and zodiac symbols, while a final section, sometimes called the balneological section, shows rows of naked women bathing in green pools connected by a network of pipes, for reasons no one has ever convincingly explained. Since the manuscript resurfaced in the early 20th century, it has passed through the hands of some of the best code breakers in history. William Friedman, the American cryptographer who helped crack Japanese diplomatic codes during World War II, spent years of his spare time on the Voynich script and made no real progress. British and American intelligence analysts looked at it during the Cold War, treating it almost like a training exercise, and came away empty-handed. In recent years, machine learning models and natural language processing algorithms have been turned loose on the text, searching for patterns consistent with real language, fabricated nonsense, or some kind of cipher. Some studies have found statistical patterns that resemble real language structure, which argues against it being random gibberish. Other studies argue the patterns are consistent with a generated hoax text. The two camps have never agreed. Theories about its origin range from the mundane to the wild. Some scholars believe it is an invented language created by a medieval mystic or secret religious order seeking to record forbidden knowledge. Others propose it is an elaborate hoax, perhaps created for a wealthy patron willing to pay for a magical book, regardless of whether it meant anything. A few have suggested it may be a real language, using a genuine alphabet that has simply been lost, an extinct dialect with no surviving second sample anywhere else in the world. Without a second relevant text to compare it against, modern translation methods, which rely heavily on cross-referencing, are essentially useless. The manuscript sits in its climate-controlled case at Yale, fully digitized and available to anyone online, and still no one, anywhere, has ever produced a translation that the wider academic community accepts as genuine. The Antikythera mechanism. In 1901, divers working a shipwreck near the Greek island of Antikythera pulled up a corroded lump of bronze that sat largely ignored in a museum drawer for years. It was not until decades later, when researchers began cleaning and x-raying the fragments, that anyone realized what they were actually holding. Inside, the corrosion was a system of at least 30 interlocking bronze gears, some no larger than a coin, arranged with a level of precision that simply should not have existed in the ancient world. The ship is believed to have sunk sometime around 70 to 60 BCE. Once, researchers used modern X-ray and CT imaging to peer through the corrosion without damaging the fragments further. The true scope of the device became clear. It was not a toy or a decorative object. It was a mechanical computer designed to track the position of the sun and moon, predict eclipses years in advance, and even account for the slightly irregular speed of the moon's orbit, using a clever pin-and-slot mechanism that mimics what modern engineers would call a variable speed gear train. A back panel, deciphered only in the last 15 years using high-resolution imaging, turned out to contain a kind of operating manual, inscribed in tiny Greek lettering, instructing the user on what each dial represented. The unsettling part is not that the ancient Greeks understood astronomy. We have known for a long time that Greek astronomers like Hipparchus made remarkably accurate calculations about the heavens. The unsettling part is that someone in that era had the engineering skill to translate that abstract mathematical knowledge into a physical machine with dozens of precisely cut, interlocking gears, something not seen again in the historical record for well over 1,000 years until early astronomical clocks began appearing in medieval Europe. Cicero, writing in the same era the device was built, mentioned that the inventor Archimedes had built similar globes and devices that modeled the heavens, which suggests the Antikythera mechanism may not have been a one-of-a-kind curiosity, but a surviving example of a broader tradition of Greek mechanical engineering that has otherwise been completely lost to history. If that is true, then somewhere between the fall of the device's creators and the rise of the European clockmaking tradition, an entire branch of ancient technology simply vanished, and we are left holding the only fragment that survived the journey. The Dyatlov Pass Incident. In late January 1959, a group of 9 experienced hikers, students, and young graduates from the Ural Polytechnical Institute set off into the northern Ural Mountains of the Soviet Union under the leadership of Igor Dyatlov. They were skilled outdoorsmen, well prepared for the brutal Russian winter, and they planned to summit a mountain the local Mansi people called Dead Mountain. They never came back. When search parties finally located the campsite weeks later, what they found made no sense. The tent had been cut open from the inside, not the outside, as if the hikers themselves had slashed their way out in a desperate hurry. Footprints in the snow, made by people wearing only socks or even bare feet, led away from the tent toward a nearby tree line, in temperatures cold enough to cause frostbite within minutes. Some of the hikers were found near a makeshift fire at the base of a large cedar tree, having apparently tried to climb it, judging by broken branches roughly 5 meters up, as if trying to see something or escape something in the dark. The condition of the bodies only deepened the mystery. Several had injuries consistent with extreme blunt force trauma, including major chest fractures and a skull fracture, yet there were no external wounds or bruising to suggest a physical attack or a fall. One investigator at the time compared the force required to cause the injuries to that of a car crash. One woman was missing her tongue, eyes, part of her lips, and facial tissue, which some attributed to natural decomposition in the running creek where her body was found, though not everyone has accepted that explanation. The official Soviet investigation, after a brief and unusually shallow inquiry, closed the case in 1959 with a vague conclusion blaming an unnamed, compelling natural force, offered no further detail, and sealed the files for decades. Over the years, theories have piled up. Some researchers point to a rare and poorly understood weather phenomenon called a katabatic wind, a sudden violent downslope gust that could have forced the hikers to flee the tent in a panic without dressing properly. Others have proposed an avalanche, though search teams at the time found no avalanche debris near the tent. Soviet military testing in the area, involving secret weapons or even radiation, has been suggested for years, partly because some of the clothing recovered tested positive for elevated radioactivity, though the test result itself remains disputed and unverified by independent sources. In 2019, Russian authorities reopened the case and, after new investigation, concluded an avalanche was the likely cause. But many independent researchers and several relatives of the victims have publicly rejected that conclusion as failing to account for the specific pattern of injuries and the missing avalanche evidence. More than 60 years later, the file remains, in practice, unresolved in the eyes of many who have studied it closely. The Mary Celeste. On December 5th, 1872, the crew of the British ship Dei Gratia spotted a vessel adrift in the Atlantic, roughly 600 miles from the coast of Portugal, behaving oddly, its sails partly set and flapping uselessly in the wind. As they drew closer, they realized it was the Mary Celeste, an American merchant ship that had departed New York for Genoa, Italy, a little over a month earlier, carrying a cargo of industrial alcohol. When the boarding party climbed aboard, the ship was eerily intact, but utterly empty. The captain, Benjamin Briggs, his wife, his 2-year-old daughter, and the entire crew of 7 sailors were simply gone. There was no sign of violence anywhere on board. The cargo of alcohol barrels was still largely in place, though 9 of them were later found to be empty. The crew's personal belongings, including the captain's pipes and the family's valuables, were left behind, which immediately ruled out the most obvious theory of piracy, since pirates would have stripped the ship of anything valuable. The ship's only lifeboat was missing, along with the ship's papers and navigational instruments, suggesting the crew left in an organized, deliberate fashion rather than fleeing in blind panic, yet no trace of the lifeboat or anyone aboard it was ever found. The investigation that followed in Gibraltar became almost as strange as the disappearance itself. The lead attorney general at the inquiry became fixated on the idea of foul play involving the crew of the Dei Gratia, an accusation that ultimately went nowhere and was eventually dropped for lack of any supporting evidence. Over the following decades, theories multiplied. Some proposed that fumes leaking from the alcohol cargo caused the crew to fear an explosion and abandon ship in a hurry, perhaps planning to wait nearby in the lifeboat until the danger passed, only for a sudden storm or snapped tow line to separate them from the Mary Celeste forever, leaving them stranded at sea. Others have pointed to a freak waterspout or rogue wave that may have damaged the ship's pump systems, convincing the crew the vessel was sinking when it was not. Seaquakes, mutiny, and even insurance fraud involving the captain have all been proposed, and all have been challenged by some detail of the physical evidence that does not quite fit. No bodies, no lifeboat, and no surviving witness account have ever surfaced in over 150 years, and the case remains, by any honest measure, completely unsolved. The Tunguska event. At around 7:14 in the morning on June 30th, 1908, witnesses in the remote Siberian region near the Podkamennaya Tunguska River saw a column of bluish light streak across the sky, brighter than the sun, followed by a flash and a shockwave so powerful it knocked people off their feet dozens of miles away. Windows shattered in towns over 200 miles distant. The explosion is now estimated to have released energy roughly equivalent to a large hydrogen bomb, and it flattened an estimated 80 million trees across more than 770 square miles of forest, with trees near the center scorched and stripped of their branches while still standing upright, and trees farther out knocked flat in a pattern radiating outward like spokes on a wheel. Because the region was so remote, and because Russia was dealing with political upheaval in the years that followed, the first scientific expedition to the site did not arrive until 1927, almost 2 decades later. When the Soviet mineralogist Leonid Kulik finally reached the area, he expected to find a massive meteor crater. He found nothing of the kind. There was no central crater, and despite extensive searching over the following years, no meteorite fragments large enough to account for an explosion of that scale have ever been definitively recovered at the site. The leading scientific explanation today holds that the explosion was caused by a stony asteroid or icy comet fragment roughly 50 to 60 meters across that exploded in the atmosphere a few miles above the ground, an airburst event, rather than a body that struck the surface directly, which would explain the absence of a crater. This explanation is widely accepted, but it does not fully satisfy everyone, because the precise composition of the object and why so little physical trace of it has ever been found despite decades of searching remains genuinely unresolved. Some researchers have proposed it may have been a comet fragment composed largely of ice, which would have vaporized almost completely on impact with the atmosphere, leaving little behind. Soviet scientists in the mid-20th century also seriously investigated and ultimately could not rule out the far stranger possibility that the event involved some other natural process entirely, since the explosion's airburst altitude and energy yield were difficult to reconcile precisely with known meteor behavior at the time. More than a century later, Tunguska remains the largest impact event in recorded history, and we still cannot say with complete certainty exactly what object caused it or precisely why it left so little physical evidence behind. The Baghdad Battery. In 1936, workers excavating near the village of Kujut Rabu, close to Baghdad, uncovered a small clay jar dating to roughly the Parthian era, sometime between 250 BCE and 250 CE. Inside the jar was a rolled copper cylinder, sealed at the bottom with a disc of copper soldered into place. Suspended inside the copper cylinder, without touching its walls, was an iron rod, held in place by an asphalt plug at the top. When the German archaeologist Wilhelm König examined the object years later, he noticed something that startled him. The arrangement was structurally almost identical to a simple electrochemical cell, what we would today recognize as the basic components of a battery, 2 different metals separated by an electrolyte. König proposed that if the jar had once been filled with an acidic liquid such as vinegar or wine, it could have generated a small but measurable electric current. In the decades since, several researchers, including the American engineer Willard Gray, have built working replicas of the jar, filled them with grape juice or vinegar, and produced a measurable, if weak, electrical voltage, somewhere around half a volt to 2 volts, depending on the exact replica and electrolyte used. What no one can agree on is what, if anything, the ancient builders actually used it for. Some have proposed it was used for electroplating, lightly coating cheaper metal objects in a thin layer of gold or silver using electric current, a technique that would not be formally invented again, as far as this historical record shows, until the early 1800s. Others suggest a far less technical purpose, a religious or ceremonial device, perhaps used by a priest to deliver a mild, static-like shock to worshippers as a kind of staged miracle, with the actual electrical principle behind it being an accident no one at the time fully understood. A more conservative camp of archaeologists argues the object may not have been a battery at all, but a container for storing sacred scrolls, with the metal arrangement being incidental rather than functional. The original artifact was housed in the National Museum of Iraq and was reported missing or looted during the chaos following the 2003 invasion, along with thousands of other artifacts, meaning that the one physical object at the center of this entire debate may now be lost to history, leaving only photographs, sketches, and competing theories behind. The Nazca lines carved into the arid desert plateau of southern Peru are hundreds of lines, geometric shapes, and figures so enormous that for centuries they went almost completely unnoticed by anyone standing on the ground. It was not until commercial airplanes began flying over the region in the 1920s and 1930s that pilots first reported seeing the full shapes. A hummingbird with a wingspan of over 60 feet, a monkey with a spiral tail, a condor, a spider, and dozens of long, perfectly straight lines stretching for miles across the desert floor, some running for over 30 miles without significant deviation. The lines themselves were created using a remarkably simple method. Workers removed the layer of reddish-brown iron oxide-coated pebbles covering the desert surface, exposing the lighter-colored ground beneath. Because the Nazca Desert is one of the driest, calmest places on Earth, with almost no rain and very little wind, these shallow trenches have remained largely intact for an estimated 1,900 to 2,000 years, attributed to the Nazca culture that flourished in the region between roughly 100 BCE and 800 CE. The question that has driven nearly a century of research is not how the lines were made. Archaeologists generally agree on the method, but why, and crucially, how the Nazca people designed such enormous, precisely proportioned figures without ever being able to see the full image from the ground. American researcher Maria Reich spent decades of her life living near the site, mapping the lines by hand and proposing that many of them functioned as a kind of giant astronomical calendar, with certain lines aligning to the positions of the sun and stars at key points in the agricultural year. Other archaeologists have proposed the lines served as ritual walking paths, used in processions tied to water and fertility rituals in a desert that desperately needed both. A more recent theory suggests some animal figures may represent constellations recognized in Andean star lore. None of these theories has been definitively proven, and no contemporary written record from the Nazca culture survives to settle the debate, leaving the purpose of one of the largest and most visually striking sets of geoglyphs on the planet still, fundamentally, a matter of educated guesswork. The disappearance of D.B. Cooper. On November 24, 1971, a man calling himself Dan Cooper boarded Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305, a routine flight from Portland to Seattle. Once in the air, he passed a note to a flight attendant claiming he had a bomb in his briefcase. He demanded $200,000 in cash and 4 parachutes upon landing in Seattle, and remarkably, the airline complied, landing the plane and meeting his demands in the hope of resolving the situation peacefully and protecting the other passengers. After releasing the passengers and most of the crew in Seattle, Cooper ordered the pilots to fly toward Mexico City at a low altitude and slow speed, with the rear staircase of the Boeing 727 left down. Somewhere over the dense forest of southwestern Washington state, in the middle of a cold, rainy night, he lowered the staircase and jumped out of the aircraft with the money strapped to his body, vanishing into the darkness below. He was never seen again. The FBI launched what became one of the longest and most extensive manhunts in its history, officially known as Norjack, and the case remained open for 45 years before finally being closed in 2016 due to a lack of new leads, without ever identifying who Cooper actually was. The investigation faced an enormous, almost impossible search radius, since investigators were never entirely certain exactly where along the flight path he had jumped, and the terrain below was remote, mountainous, and heavily forested. In 1980, an 8-year-old boy found a deteriorated bundle of cash along the banks of the Columbia River, later confirmed through serial numbers to be a portion of the ransom money, which proved Cooper had landed, or at least the money had ended up, somewhere in that general drainage area. But the discovery raised more questions than it answered, since it offered no clue about what happened to Cooper himself. No parachute, no skeleton, no further trace of the money, and no credible confirmed sighting of the man has ever surfaced in over 50 years. To this day, no one knows his real identity, whether he survived the jump into the freezing, mountainous wilderness below, or what ultimately became of him, making it the only unsolved case of air piracy in American commercial aviation history, the WOW signal. On the night of August 15, 1977, an astronomer named Jerry Eman was reviewing printouts from the Big Ear radio telescope at Ohio State University, a project quietly scanning the sky for any unusual radio signal that might suggest a transmission of non-natural origin. Most nights produced nothing but background noise. That night was different. The telescope picked up a narrowband radio signal lasting a full 72 seconds, far stronger than the background static around it, and Eman, reviewing the data days later, was so struck by the reading that he circled the relevant string of numbers and letters on the printout and wrote a single word in red ink in the margin: "Wow." The name stuck, and the signal has been known as the WOW signal ever since. What made the reading so compelling was its narrow frequency. The signal arrived at almost exactly 1420 megahertz, a frequency very close to the natural emission line of neutral hydrogen, the most abundant element in the universe, a frequency long theorized by scientists like Frank Drake to be a logical marker, frequency that an intelligent civilization might choose for interstellar communication, precisely because any other civilization with basic radio astronomy would also recognize its significance. The signal's shape also matched what researchers expected a signal from a fixed point in deep space to look like as the rotating telescope swept past it, rising and falling in strength in a pattern consistent with a real astronomical source, rather than a stray reflection or local interference. And then it was gone. Despite repeated attempts to detect the signal again, using the same telescope and later using far more sensitive instruments, it was never observed a second time, not on that frequency, from that patch of sky, ever again. Over the following decades, researchers have proposed a long list of possible mundane explanations: a passing comet emitting hydrogen gas, a reflection off a piece of space debris, a secret military transmission, or simple equipment malfunction. Each explanation has run into the same wall. None of them fully account for both the signal's narrow bandwidth and its precise correlation with the hydrogen line in a way that satisfies the original researchers. Jerry Amon himself spent the rest of his life cautious about overstating the case, while also acknowledging that he had never found an explanation that truly fit all the data. Nearly 50 years later, the WOW signal remains the strongest, cleanest, and most scientifically credible candidate ever picked up for a signal of unknown, possibly non-human origin, and it has never repeated. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of today's journey through the unexplained. If any of these mysteries stuck with you, or if you have your own theory about what really happened in that tent on Dead Mountain, or what Cooper's real name might have been, let us know in the comments below. Whether you've been with this channel since the beginning or you just found us today, we'd love to have you stick around. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any of our upcoming journeys into the world's most baffling unsolved cases. See you in the next video.